Welcome back. Welcome back to Shiloh National Military Park. Anybody who's been here less than 2 days and 15 miles, raise your hand, because we'll make sure that this last program will get you limbered up. Limbered up. Hey, thank you very much on behalf of Perry and Shiloh Discussion Group, everybody who's in the group and everybody who just came. It's been wonderful again, and we've had 2 days of long-form, cross-country, public history programming on the Battle of Shiloh, and I think we've all learned an enormous amount, and if not about the Battle of Shiloh, about our bodies. But yeah, yesterday we had Dr. Tim Smith take us around the battlefield, visited almost every Union encampment, and got a real flavor for the fact that this was a battle that was fought in a city. This may have been the largest city battle, the largest urban combat in the war. The only difference being the city was temporary. It was an army camp. And so yesterday, with all that time and all of that effort and all of that ground we covered, I think Dr. Smith gave us a sense of just how expansive and involving those camps were to the battle and to the lives of the men that lived there. So that's what we had yesterday. This morning we talked about the experiences of straight up military history experiences of the brigade of General John Bowen, the Confederate brigade of John Bowen. And one thing we learned is that in those reports, the Confederates always said, we just advanced from here to here, not we went down into a huge hole, slid all the way down on the dead leaves, and went knee-high into a puddle of mud. But now we know that. Now we know that. And so we're going to finish the program. We're going to finish our epic hikes for 2023 with a little bit of a departure from the previous 2 programs. One program is very geographical, the camps. The second program is a traditional military history. We followed a brigade, and this is going to be a program that intertwines literature. It intertwines writing and literature with the battlefield. Now, there are very few opportunities that pop up for you to have the experience of sitting by the fire with your pipe and your book and have that relate to being out onto the battlefield. And this program will be one of those. So this program is called What I Saw of Shiloh, and it is an interpretation of an essay by that name by the American writer Ambrose Bierce. Ambrose Bierce, we're going to meet him in just a second, but the short story, he was a very prominent writer, a very prominent journalist in the late 19th century, writing for the San Francisco Examiner, and he had a long career as a journalist that earned him the title Bitter Bierce. Bitter Bierce, America's great misanthrope. So we're talking about a man who lived a long time into his 8th decade, and every single day he seemed to get just a little more sardonic and bitter and disappointed with the world. And by the time his life came to an end, as far as we know, he was long remembered as Bitter Bierce, with the acid pen taking down politicians and celebrities and all the rest. And by the time his life ended, as far as we know, most folks had forgotten Sergeant Ambrose Bierce of the 9th Indiana Infantry. Yet Sergeant Bierce led a platoon of the 9th Indiana Infantry here at the Battle of Shiloh on the 7th of April, 1862. And yes, he left behind that bitter, sardonic pen, left behind his account of what happened to him on this battlefield, what I saw of Shiloh. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow Ambrose Bierce. We're going to follow Sergeant Bierce right across this battlefield in his footsteps, because we can do that. We have enough information on the 9th Indiana and Sergeant Bierce to follow his essay right across the battlefield and be on the spot where he was when he's telling the story that we're hearing. I'm going to let Sergeant Bierce do a lot of our narration today, and if it ever seems like I'm talking too much, just throw up a hand and say, let's get back to Bitter Bierce. He writes much better than Bitter Bjorn. But that's the idea. We are going to interpret what I saw of Shiloh in the footsteps of Ambrose Bierce. If you're a fan of Ambrose Bierce, and I know we have some, full disclosure, the essay, in order to bring it in on time and to rewrite, did need to be edited for brevity, and yours truly played the part of the editor. And since Ambrose Bierce is not around to complain, as far as we know, I will simply take the position that he never cared whether he twisted somebody's words. So if he doesn't like it, this is just payback. It's 100-some years later. But yeah, in order to take a piece of literature that is meant to be read in a book in front of a roaring fire on a cold night in the summer of San Francisco, a frigid San Francisco summer night, then some things are good for reading. But if you're going to say it out loud, some things are not good for reading. The things that my high school composition teacher called compound sentences and complex sentences seem to work a little better on the page and sound rather absurd when you try to say them, and you're constantly digressing a lot. So we have cut the essay for brevity, and that should get us to the end of our program before the sun gets too far below the horizon. But before we go, okay, let's bring the biography of Ambrose Bierce in here, and let's bring the 9th Indiana Regiment to the battlefield so that we know what he's talking about when we start reading. Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce, born in Meigs County, Ohio, 19 years before he enlisted. I don't know which year it is, but 19 years before he enlisted, the youngest son of a family of fundamentalist Christian people. The Bierce family to which he belonged, he was the youngest son of a family that had 9 children, all of them named for Old Testament prophets with the letter A. Okay. And the answer to the question you might be thinking of is, yeah, there are. There are more Old Testament prophets whose names begin with A than 9. The only sibling that wanted anything to do with Brother Ambrose was Brother Albert, who also served in the Civil War. Most of the other Bierce kids lost touch with kid Brother Ambrose. Seems to be a mutual understanding between all of them. Young Ambrose did not pick up on the evangelicalism of the family and was rather rebellious in the household. He was at one point finally sent away to live with an uncle, who could better take care of him. This old uncle, Bierce, was an old Ohio farmer, and by going into that household, young Ambrose was exposed to a very militant form of abolitionism. Instead of religion, now there's politics, militant politics. And indeed, the Ambrose Bierce's uncle had a neighbor of the same political leanings by the name of Old John Brown, and he helped Old Brown get some cast-off army artillery small swords that Brown and his sons later took to Kansas in order to carry out the Potawatomi massacre upon their pro-slavery neighbors on Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. So I don't know whether Ambrose ever met Old Brown. I just know that that's part of the story here. Now, young Ambrose does end up in the Kentucky Military Academy. There are other Civil War vets that went to Kentucky Military Academy. He did like it there. He kind of liked military school, and he took to it. I do not know for right now whether he finished his studies there, but there in Kentucky in a military school, he picked up something that he liked about life. Not so rebellious anymore. He found some systems. He found some mentors that he liked. And he certainly picked up military drill, and he enjoyed that. When the Civil War started, he happened to be in Indiana. He'd moved, by this time he'd migrated from Meigs County, Ohio to through other parts of Ohio to Kentucky, and now he's living in Indiana. And from the beginning of the war, he signs up for the infantry, the 9th Indiana Infantry Regiment. And being a kid who had gone to a military school for a couple of semesters at the age of 19, at the beginning of the Civil War, this entitled Ambrose Bierce to the rank of sergeant. He could immediately make three chevrons just because he'd had probably the equivalency of junior ROTC for a couple of semesters in high school. But the 9th Indiana goes off to West Virginia. They campaign for West Virginia, through those hills for 90 days. At the end of their 90-day enlistment, they came back to Indiana. Some of them went home, others re-enlisted. Sergeant Bierce did re-enlist in the 9th Indiana, and then now that the 9th Indiana had become a 3-year regiment, they were sent to join the army of General Don Carlos Buell in Kentucky. And down there in Kentucky, the 9th Indiana went into Buell's army. Buell put him into the division of General William Bull Nelson, and the 9th Indiana was grouped into a brigade, the 19th Brigade, under the command of Colonel William Babcock Hazen. William Babcock Hazen, who will be part of our discussion today because he's the brigade commander for the brigade that Bierce was in. Bierce will refer to him, although not name him, in the essay. The 19th Brigade also included the 6th Kentucky Regiment and the 41st Ohio Regiment. 9th Indiana, 6th Kentucky, 41st Ohio. We'll meet them a little bit later. When the battle began, Nelson's division of Buell's army, having marched from Nashville, was in Savannah, Tennessee. And Bierce is going to talk about that in a minute, so we're not going to cover it too much. But that division did march overland from Savannah to Pittsburgh Landing, the opposite side of the river, Pittsburgh Landing, and were shuttled across on the evening of April 6, 1862. If you look across the road here, you're going to see a yellow rectangular marker. And as far as I know, I could be wrong, probably the only yellow rectangular marker on the battlefield, a marker of General Buell's army fighting on the first day of the battle. And that is a marker to the 6th Ohio Regiment. That's part of Nelson's division. So Nelson's division with the 3 brigades arrived here in the evening of April 6, 1862. that is when Bierce arrived with the 9th Indiana after the end of the fighting on April 6, 1862. They then were included in General Nelson's order of battle and participated in the second day of the battle, which we will let the essay walk us through. So that is what brings a 19-year-old Ambrose Bierce, Sergeant Ambrose Bierce, to this battlefield. We know from his brother Albert, also remembering him, that at this time of his life, young Ambrose was very enthusiastic and gentle, and had a very humane and compassionate disposition toward other people and toward the world he lived in. Very hopeful disposition. And therefore we are about to witness the beginning of a journey that will lead from that to an icon of American literature, bitter Bierce. So let's get up and let's get ready to start.
Do we know if he had any participation in any prior military activity?
No. Only J. Rogers.
What I saw of Shiloh.
Start with, how shall we start this?
Arma Virumque. This is a Christian army, so he said. A regiment of Bango men he led. And this a Christian navy, added he, who sailed a thunder junk upon the sea. Better they know than men unwarlike do what is a navy and an army too. Pray God there may be sent them by and by knowledge what a Christian is and why. For somewhat lamely the conception runs of a brass-buttoned Jesus firing guns. Part 1. This is a simple story of a battle. Such a tale as may be told by a soldier who is no writer to a reader who is no soldier. The morning of Sunday, the 6th day of April, 1862, was bright and warm. Reveille had been sounded rather late, for the troops were to have a day of rest. The men were idling around the embers of their bivouac fires, some preparing breakfast, others looking carelessly to the condition of their arms and accoutrements. Still others were chatting with indolent dogmatism on that never-failing theme, the end and object of the campaign. Sentinels paced up and down the front with a lounging freedom of stride. A few limped unsoldierly in deference to blistered feet. At a little distance in the rear of the stacked arms were a few tents, out of which frowsy-headed officers occasionally peered, languidly calling to their servants to fetch a basin of water, dust a coat, or polish a scabbard. Trim young mounted orderlies, bearing dispatches obviously unimportant, moved amongst the men, enduring with unconcerned their good-humored raillery, the penalty of superior station. Little Negroes, of not very clearly defined status and function, lolled on their stomachs or slumbered peacefully, unaware of the practical waggery prepared by white hands for their undoing. Presently the flag, hanging limp and lifeless at headquarters, was seen to lift itself spiritedly from the staff. At the same instant was heard a dull, distant sound like the heavy breathing of some great animal below the horizon. The flag had lifted its head to listen. There was a momentary lull in the hum of the human swarm. Then, as the flag drooped, the hush passed away. But there were some hundreds more men on their feet than before, some thousands of hearts beating with a quicker pulse. Again the flag made a warning sign, and again the breeze bore to our ears the long, deep sighing of iron lungs. Received the sharp word of command, sprang to its feet, and stood in groups at attention. I've since seen similar effects produced by earthquakes. I'm not sure, but the ground was shaking then. The mess cooks lifted up their steaming camp kettles and prepared to cast out. The mounted orderlies had somehow disappeared. Officers came ducking from beneath their tents and gathered in groups. Headquarters was a swarming hive. The sound of the great guns now came in regular throbbings, the strong, full pulse of the fever of battle. The flag flapped excitedly, shaking out its blazonry of stars and stripes with a sort of fierce delight. Toward the knot of officers in its shadow dashed a mounted aide-de-camp, and in the instant rose the sharp, clear notes of a bugle. Caught up and repeated, and passed on by other bugles, until the level reaches of brown fields, the line of woods trending away to the far hills, and the unseen valleys beyond were telling of the sound. The farther, fainter strains, half drowned in ringing cheers as the men ran to range themselves behind the stacks of arms, for this call was not the wearisome general before which the tents go down. It was the exhilarating assembly, which goes to the heart as wine and stirs the blood like the kisses of a beautiful woman. The assembly! Who that has heard it singing to him above the grumble of great guns can ever forget the wild intoxication of its music? Let's go. 2. The Confederate forces in Kentucky and Tennessee had suffered a series of reverses culminating in the loss of Nashville. The blow was severe. Immense quantities of war material had fallen to the victor, together with all of the important points. General Johnston withdrew the Confederate Army to Corinth in northern Mississippi, where he hoped so to recruit and equip it as to enable it to assume the offensive and retake the lost territory. The town of Corinth was a wretched place, the capital of a swamp. It is a day's march west of the Tennessee River, which runs nearly north. It is navigable to this point, which is to say Pittsburgh Landing, where the Corinth road got to the river, where Corinth got to it by a road worn through a thickly wooded country seamed with ravines and bayous. The Corinth Road was at a certain season a branch of the Tennessee River. Its mouth was Pittsburgh Landing. Here in 1862 were some fields and a house or two. Now there is a national cemetery and a number of other improvements. It was at Pittsburgh Landing that Grant established his army with a river in his rear and 2 toy steamboats as a means of communication with the other side. The question has been asked, why did General Grant occupy the enemy's side of the river in the face of a superior force before the arrival of Buell? Buell had a long way to come. Perhaps Grant was tired of waiting. Certainly Johnston was, for in the gray of the morning of April 6th, the Confederate forces, having moved out of Corinth 2 days before, fell upon Grant's advance brigades and destroyed them. Grant was at Savannah at the time, but hastened to Pittsburgh Landing to find his camps in the hands of the enemy and the remnants of his beaten army cooped up with an impassable river at their backs for moral support. I have related how the news of this affair came to us at Savannah. It came on the wind, a messenger that does not bear copious details. Yes, we're more toward his old age then. Over by Pittsburgh Landing are some low bare hills. In the dusk of the evening of April 6th, this open space, as seen from the other side of the river, would have appeared to have been ruled in long, dark lines, with new lines being constantly drawn across. Lines were the regiments of Buell's leading division, which, having moved up from Savannah through a country presenting nothing but impassable swamps, rank undergrowth of jungle, was arriving at the scene of action breathless, footsore, and faint with hunger. It had been a terrible race. Some regiments had lost a third of their number from fatigue, the men dropping out of the ranks as if shot and left to recover or die at their leisure. Neither was the scene to which they had been invited likely to inspire. The eyes reported only matter for despair. Before us ran the turbulent river, vexed with plunging shells and obscured in spots by blue sheets of low-lying smoke. The two little steamers were doing their duty very well. They came over to us empty and went back crowded, sitting very low in the water, apparently on the point of capsizing. On the heights above, the battle was burning brightly enough. There were broad flushings in the sky, against which the branches of the trees showed black. The air was full of noises. To the right and left, the musketry rattled smartly and petulantly. Directly in front, it sighed and growled. There were deep, shaking explosions, smart shocks, the whisper of stray bullets, the hurtle of conical shells, the rush of round shot. There were faint cheers. Occasionally, against the glare behind the trees, could be seen some moving black figures, singularly indistinct, but apparently no longer than a thumb. It seemed to me ludicrously like figures of demons in an old allegorical print of hell. To destroy these and their belongings, the enemy needed but another hour of daylight. Nay, to make his victory sure, it did not need that the sun should pause in the heavens. One of the many random shots falling into the river would have done the business had chance directed it into the engine room of one of those steamers. You can perhaps fancy the anxiety with which we watched them leaping down on us. But we had two other allies besides the knight. Just where the enemy had pushed his right flank to the river was the mouth of a wide bayou, and here two gunboats had taken station. They too were of the toy sort. They staggered under a heavy gun or two each. The bayou made an opening in the high bank of the river. The bank was the parapet behind which the gunboats crouched, firing up the bayou as through an embrasure. The enemy was at this disadvantage. He could not get at the gunboats, and he could advance only by exposing his flank to their ponderous missiles, one of which would have broken a half mile of his bones and thought nothing of it. Very annoying this must have been. These 20 gunners beating back an army because a sluggish creek had been pleased to fall into the river at one point rather than another. Such is the part that accident may play in the game of war. As a spectacle, this was rather fine. We could just discern the black bodies of the boats, looking very much like turtles. But when they let off their big guns, there was a conflagration. The river shuddered in its banks and hurried on, bloody, wounded, terrified. Objects a mile away sprang toward our eyes as a snake strikes at the face of his victim. Then we could hear the great shell tearing away through the air until the sound died out in the distance. And then, a surprisingly long time afterward, a dull, distant explosion and a sudden silence of small arms told their own tale. For there was, I remember, no elephant on the boat that passed us across the river that evening. Nor, I think, any hippopotamus. These would have been out of place. We had, however, a woman. She was a fine creature, this woman, somebody's wife. Her mission, as she understood it, was to inspire the failing heart with courage. And when she selected mine, I felt less flattered by her preference than astonished by her penetration. How did she know? She stood on the upper deck with the red blaze of battle bathing her beautiful face, the twinkle of 1,000 rifles mirrored in her eyes, and displaying a small ivory-handled pistol. She told me in a sentence punctuated by the thunder of great guns that if it came to the worst, she would do her duty like a man. I am proud to remember that I took off my hat to this little fool.
We know who she was.
Follow me.
What I saw, not what happened.
Yeah.
Problem is not how you stay off the Colonel Francis
Georgia was killed at the Battle of the First World War. And they put up a monument to Bartow. The Confederates put up a monument to Bartow on Henry Hill within a few months of the run. And then the Yankees came and tore it down. Monuments are not permanent. Maybe you need to come to terms with that, never mind. So you know, what counts as first? All I know is, what I could say is that Bierce Hazen's monument at Stones River is a mark. It's just one of the incredible things you have to go see to understand Stones River.
Were those Hazen's men buried around that?
Yeah. All right. We're now at the position where General William B. Hazen's brigade deployed for line of battle, in line of battle on the evening of April 6, 1862, having gotten off of the steamboats at Pittsburgh Landing, marched very slowly through the driving rain to this position. The Hamburg and Savannah Road is immediately behind you, the historic road. And here they deployed in line of battle, 2 regiments forward, 1 regiment in the rear as a reserve. And then that brings us back to Sergeant Bierce's narrative. 5. By the time my regiment had reached the plateau, night had put an end to the struggle. The gunboats blazed away at set intervals all night long just to make the enemy uncomfortable and break him of his sleep. For us, there was no rest. Foot by foot, we moved through the dusky fields. We knew not whither. Whether there were men all about us, but no campfires. To have made a blaze would have been madness that night. They gathered in groups by the wayside. They recounted the depressing incidents of the day. A thoughtful officer shut their mouths with a sharp word of command as he passed. A wise one, coming later, encouraged them to repeat their doleful tale all along the line. Hidden in the hollows and behind clumps of rank brambles were large tents, dimly lighted with candles, but looking comfortable. The kind of comfort they supplied was indicated by pairs of men entering and reappearing, bearing litters. The low moans from within and the long rows of dead with covered faces outside. These tents were constantly receiving the wounded, yet they were never full. They were continually ejecting the dead, yet they were never empty. It was as if the helpless had been carried in and murdered, that they might not hamper those whose business it was to die tomorrow. The night was now black, dark. It had begun to rain. Inch by inch we crept along, treading on one another's heels by way of keeping together. Very often we struck our feet against the dead, more frequently against those who still had enough spirit to resent it with a moan. These were lifted carefully to one side and abandoned. Some had sense enough to ask in their weak way for water. Absurd. Their clothes were soaken, their hair was dank, their white faces were clammy and cold. Besides, none of us had any water. There was plenty coming, though, for before midnight a thunderstorm broke upon us with great violence. We moved in running water up to our ankles. Happily, we were in a forest, or with an enemy standing close to his guns, the disclosures of the lightning might have been inconvenient. As it was, the incessant blaze enabled us to consult our watches and encouraged us by displaying our numbers. Our black, sinuous line, creeping like a giant serpent beneath the trees, was apparently interminable. I am almost ashamed to say how sweet I found the companionship of those coarse men. A few inaudible commands from an invisible leader had placed us in order of battle. But where was the enemy? Had our other divisions arrived during the night and passed the river to assist us? Or were we to oppose our paltry breasts to an army flushed with victory? What protected our right? Who lay upon our left? Was there really anything in the front? There came, borne to us on the raw morning air, the long, weird note of a bugle. It was directly before us. It rose with a low, clear, deliberate warble, and seemed to float in the gray sky like the note of a lark. The bugle calls of the Federal and Confederate armies were the same. It was the assembly. As it died away, I observed that the atmosphere had suffered a change. It was electric. Wings were growing on blistered feet. Bruised muscles and jolted bones, shoulders pounded by the cruel knapsack, eyelids leaden from lack of sleep. All were pervaded by that subtle fluid. All were unconscious of their clay. The men thrust forward their heads. They expanded their eyes. They clenched their teeth. They breathed hard as if throttled by tugging at a leash. If you had laid your hands in the hair or beard of one of those men, it would have crackled and shot sparks. Let's go. They just had the Mothman Festival, and yeah, I would have liked to be there.
Yes, it is.
But that's cool. Okay, we got everybody?
7, 8, 9 if you do it.
All right.
7, 8,
We stretched out. I suppose the country lying between Corinth and Pittsburgh Landing could boast a few inhabitants other than alligators. What manner of people they were, it is impossible to say, inasmuch as the fighting dispersed or possibly exterminated them. Perhaps in merely classifying them as non-alligator, I shall describe them with sufficient particularity and at the same time divert from myself the natural suspicion attaching to a writer who points out to persons who do not know him the peculiarities of persons he does not know. But one thing, however, I hope I may without offense affirm of these swamp dwellers: they were pious. To what deity their veneration was given, whether like the Egyptians they worshipped the crocodile or like other Americans adored themselves, I do not pretend to guess. But whoever or whatever may have been the divinity whose ends they shaped, unto him or it they had builded a temple. This humble edifice, centrally situated in the heart of the wilderness and conveniently accessible to crows, had been christened Shiloh Chapel, whence the name of the battle. The fact of a Christian church giving name to the wholesale cutting of Christian throats by Christian hands need not be dwelt upon here. The frequency of its recurrence in the history of our species has somewhat abated any moral interest that would otherwise attach to it. Let's continue.
Before dawn on the morning of the 7th of April, 1862, General William Bull Nelson's division pushed down through the rain while it was still raining into the bottoms of Dill Branch Ravine.
Oh, God.
They began where the tablets were and where we showed them, but they pushed down into the bottoms of Dill Branch Ravine in order to be ready as soon as it was time to attack in the morning. And indeed, as soon as the sun crested the sky before 6 in the morning, the skirmishers kicked off and began climbing, crawling, slithering out of Dill Branch Ravine, up and out, and then mud, soaked and covered in mud, emerged in through the Lauman's camps, which some of you have visited recently, and into the cloud field. And here is a wonderful place to see exactly, it would have been a division, 5,000 men, 2 regiments forward, 1 back. Skirmishers forward, the reserves behind them in the main line of battle, standing just below the crest of the ridge, so that they would not be easy targets for any Confederates that were in those woods over there. They came here, they stopped, and here they stood, and here they waited. Here they waited for someone else to come in and tie off to the right. So, once again, if anybody's still laboring under the misconception that the second day of Shiloh was counterattack, Buell and Grant go in and bash the Confederates and push them out. No, no. By 3 in the morning, the guys were standing at their arms, knee-deep in mud. By 6:30, they advanced this far. And there they waited for someone to come up and tie in on their right. Those someones were still on steamboats in the Tennessee River. Crittenden's division.
We talked about them earlier today. Crittenden's division finally got off the steamboats. They finally got organized. They finally came marching up these muddy roads. And then by 9 in the morning, a good 3 hours probably of standing around, Crittenden began to tie in. Now during this whole time, once again, the line of battle isn't just getting to stand and go to sleep. There are skirmishers, there are Confederate skirmishers in those woods. The skirmish line does crest the top of the field, and during those 3 hours, it's that that lazy crack, crack, pop, pop of skirmishers out between the lines trying to knock each other over, trying to see who's the better shot, just waiting for the real battle to start. And so here in this field, the 9th Indiana advances, and here Sergeant Bierce advances with them. We get to part 6. Owing to the darkness, the storm, and the absence of a road, it had been impossible to move the artillery from the open ground around Pittsburgh Landing. Our batteries were probably toiling after us somewhere. We could only hope that the enemy might delay his attack until they should arrive. He may delay his defense, if he like, said a young officer to whom I had imparted this wish. He had read the signs right. The words were hardly spoken when a group of staff officers around the brigade commander shot as if scattered by a whirlwind, and galloping each to the commander of a regiment gave the word. There was a momentary confusion of tongues. A thin line of skirmishers detached itself from the compact front and pushed forward. Hold on. Anyway. And pushed forward, followed by its diminutive reserves of half a company each. One of these platoons it was my fortune to command. When the straggling line of skirmishers had swept 400 or 500 yards ahead, "See," said one of my comrades, "she moves." She did indeed, and in fine style. Her front as straight as a string, her reserve regiments and columns doubled on the center, followed in true subordination. No braying of brass to apprise the enemy, no fifing and drumming to amuse him, no ostentation of gaudy flags, no nonsense. This was a matter of business. The evidence of the previous day's struggle was present in profusion. The ground was tolerably level here, the forest less dense, mostly clear of undergrowth, and occasional openings out into small natural meadows. Here and there were small pools, mere discs of rainwater with a tinge of blood. Torn with cannon shot, the trunks of the trees protruded bunches of splinters like hands, the fingers above the wound interlacing with those below. Large branches had been lopped and hung in their green heads to the ground. Angular bits of iron sticking in the sides of muddy depressions showed where shells had exploded in their furrows. Knapsacks, canteens, haversacks distended and swollen with biscuits, blankets beaten into the soil by the rain, rifles with bent barrels or splintered stocks, waist belts, hats, and the omnipresent sardine box. All the wretched refuse, all the wretched debris of battle still littered the spongy earth as far as one could see in every direction. Dead horses were everywhere. A few disabled cannons, ammunition wagons standing disconsolate behind 4 or 6 sprawling mules. Men, there were men enough. All dead, apparently, except one, who lay near where I had halted my platoon to await the slower movement of the line. A Federal sergeant, variously hurt, who had been a fine giant in his time. He lay face upward, taking in his breath in convulsive, rattling snorts and blowing it out in sputters of froth, which crawled creamily down his cheeks, piling itself alongside his neck and ears. A bullet had clipped a groove in his skull above the temple. From this, the brain protruded in bosses, dropping off in flakes and strings. I had not previously known that one could get on, even in this unsatisfactory fashion, with so little brain. One of my men asked if he should put his bayonet through him. Inexpressibly shocked by the cold-blooded proposal, I told him I thought not. It was unusual, and too many were looking. Let's go.
Where are we going?
Kurt and Jim,
Yeah.
our next stop is also next to the road.
Good.
So if you guys want to mount on it and meet us in the Wicker Field, quarter mile down the road, that's where we'll be. Straight across the battlefield where Bowen's brigade fought and drove their enemy to ground less than a day before. So we already talked about how all of this detritus of battle came to be spread across the landscape that he was looking at. Sergeant Bierce across the landscape into what's known as the Wicker Field. Like we said, Nelson's division had come up out of Dill Branch, advanced enthusiastically until 6:30 in the morning, and then stopped. Stopped and waited for Crittenden to get in and get off the boats and march on up. And then when Crittenden finally tied in to Nelson's advance, then they could advance until Crittenden's right flank was exposed, and then everybody stopped again. Stopped and waited for General McCook to come up, and his guys got off the boats and marched up. It is hurry up and wait. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Through the blood and the mud and the destruction of the previous day, with the line of battle all the way across the landscape, the reserves in front of them and the skirmishers ahead of them. And by about 9:30 to 10, they had reached this wood line on the northern end of Wicker Field. And the rest of Nelson's division were across the Hamburg-Savannah Road, advancing through the ravines, slowly, painfully skirmishing with Chalmers skirmishers, and Colonel William B. Hazen's 19th Brigade came to this wood line at the northern edge of the field. And from there they could look across to this wood line on the southern edge of the field. And General Nelson could not see anything, and Colonel Hazen could not see anything. So somebody has to go find out. That is the job of the skirmisher.
8. It was plain that the enemy had retreated to Corinth. The arrival of our fresh troops had disheartened him. 3 or 4 of his gray cavalry vedettes moving amongst the trees and the crest of the hill in our front confirmed us in this belief. An army face to face with the enemy does not employ cavalry to watch its front. True, they might have been a general and his staff. Crowning this rise, we found a level field, a quarter of a mile in width. Beyond it, a gentle acclivity covered with an undergrowth of young oaks, impervious to sight. We pushed on into the open, but the division had halted at the edge. Having orders to conform to its movements, we halted too. But that did not suit. We received an intimation to proceed. I had performed this sort of service before, and in the exercise of my discretion deployed my platoon, pushing it forward at a run with trailed arms to strengthen the skirmish line, which I overtook some 30 or 40 yards from the wood. Then, I can't describe it. The forest seemed all at once to flame up and disappear with a crash like that of a great wave upon a beach. A crash that expired in hot hissings and the sickening spat of lead against flesh. A dozen of my brave fellows tumbled over like 10 pins. Some struggled to their feet, only to go down again, and yet again. Those who stood fired into the smoking brush and doggedly retired. We had expected to find, at most, a line of skirmishers, similar to our own. It was with a view to overcoming it that I had thrown forward my little reserve. What we had found was a line of battle, coolly holding its fire until they could count our teeth. There was no more to be done but to get back across the open ground, every yard of which was throwing up its little jet of mud provoked by an impinging bullet. We got back, most of us, and I shall never forget the ludicrous incident of a young officer who had taken part in the affair, walking up to the colonel, who had been a calm and apparently impartial spectator, and gravely reporting, "The enemy is in force just beyond this field, sir." Let us go across the field. If you want to come with us, you can, but we're going back across the field to this monument over here, and we're going to do the next chapter there.
Yes, yeah, hot shower, hot shower. Yeah, and it has it's nice water pressure and very hot water. So yep. Which one do you need? Exactly. If I feel like I want to lay down, it's right there.
I was hotly engaged at this place at 10 a.m. We know that. Repulsed a heavy attack from the front, the south, charged with the brigade to the right, west, and drove back the enemy. At 12:30 p.m., it was sent by General Nelson to the road to the left to aid Colonel Amen. Casualties: killed 1 officer, 16 men, wounded 7 officers, 146 men. Total 170 casualties. Would have been out of a strength of 500 or 600. Part 9. In subordination to the design of this narrative, the incidents related necessarily group themselves about my own personality as a center, and this center, during the few terrible hours of the engagement, maintained a variably constant relation to this open field. The configuration of the ground offered us no protection. By lying flat on our faces between the guns, there were cannons along here. By lying on our faces between the guns, we were screened from view by a straggling row of brambles, which marked the course of an obsolete fence. But the enemy's grape was sharper than his eyes, and it was poor consolation to know that his gunners could not see what they were doing, so long as they did it. The shock of our own pieces nearly deafened us, but in the brief intervals we could hear the battle roaring and stammering in the dark reaches of the forest to the right and to the left, where our other divisions were dashing themselves again and again into the smoking jungle. What we would not have given to join them in their brave, hopeless task, but to lie down inglorious beneath showers of shrapnel, meekly to be blown out of life by level gusts of grape. This was horrible. Oh, those cursed guns! Not the enemy's, our own. Had it not been for them, we might have died like men. They must be supported. It was impossible to conceive that these pieces were doing the enemy as excellent a mischief as his were doing us. And it was with grim satisfaction that I saw the carriage of one and another smashed into matchwood by whooping shot and bundled out of line. All right, our next stop will be around the peach orchard area. So either get back to the, do you want to come up with us, Kurt, or do you want to go back to Jim?
I'll go with Jim.
Okay. Then the rest of us are going to,
I assume we'll find you over there.
Are going to bow to the rule of indolent practicality and go around the easy way. We've already been heroes today. We have reached a place in Sergeant Bierce's narrative where I'm going to do a little bit of clarifying. Again, we're talking about a storyteller who is only promised to tell us what he saw of Shiloh. Now, he did see something that he is going to describe in this part of the narrative. And I have no doubt that Bierce saw what he is about to describe. However, sometimes the storyteller gets the best of the historian, and so in the interest of full disclosure, we are at, historically, a time of about 10 o'clock, 10 in the morning of April 7th, 1862. And Nelson's division has advanced from the position we just were, the 9th Indiana Monument, to this position, and here they are coming in closer contact with the Confederates. Now, the Confederate main line of resistance is the Hamburg-Purdy Road, which you can see on the opposite side of the peach field and the Sarabelle cotton field, which is beyond it over there. You can see the fence over there. So these are the two main lines of battle, and between those lines of battle are skirmishers and reserves and artillery doing their thing. During that time, there is a ravine over here, which we spoke about earlier today in the Bowen's Brigade program, a ravine in which the 9th Illinois Regiment had fought on the first day of the battle. They'd been flanked out of there, they had been shot down, they'd been cut to pieces in that ravine, and then the ravine had caught fire and burned over. We talked about William McMurray was a Confederate who was traveled through that area, and he later described it as the burnt district. It burned over in that ravine, and the dead and the wounded of the 9th Illinois Regiment were in that ravine. There's no way that the timeline will line up here. Bierce is here, the Confederates are still between him and the ravine. But I think you will see from the description that it is entirely probable, entirely
Plausible.
No, it happened. He definitely went there and he saw it. He could not have described what he's about to see if he'd not walked over there and seen it. Let's just assume he did it after the battle was over.
Yes.
10. The dense forests, wholly or partly, in which were fought so many battles of the Civil War, lay upon the earth in each autumn a thick deposit of dead leaves and stems, the decay of which forms a soil of surprising depth and richness. In dry weather, the upper strata is flammable as tinder. A fire once kindled in it will spread with a slow, persistent advance as far as local conditions will permit, leaving a bed of light ashes beneath which the less combustible accretions of previous years will smolder until extinguished by rains. In many of the engagements of the war, the fallen leaves took fire and roasted the fallen men. At Shiloh, during the first day's fighting, wide tracts of woodland were burned over in this way, and scores of wounded who might have recovered perished in slow torture. I remember a deep ravine in which, by some mad freak of heroic incompetence, a part of an Illinois regiment had been surrounded and, refusing to surrender, was destroyed, as it very well deserved. My regiment, having been relieved of the guns, for no obvious purpose, I obtained leave to go down into the Valley of Death and gratify a reprehensible curiosity. The fire had swept every foot of it, and at every step I sank into ashes to the ankle. It had contained a thick undergrowth of young saplings, every one of which had been severed by a bullet, and afterward burnt and the stumps charred. Death had put his sickle into the thicket, and fire had gleaned the field. Along a line which was not that of extreme depression, but equidistant from the heights on either hand, lay the bodies, half buried in ashes, some in the unlovely looseness of attitude denoting sudden death by the bullet, but by far the greater number in postures of agony that told of the tormenting flame. Their clothing was half burnt away, their hair and beard entirely. The rain had come too late to save their nails. Some were swollen to double girth, others were shriveled to mannequins. According to degree of exposure, their faces were bloated and black or yellow and shrunken. The contraction of muscles that had given them claws for hands had cursed each countenance with a hideous grin. Bah! I cannot catalogue the charms of these gallant gentlemen who had got what they enlisted for. All right. At this point in the battle, General Nelson had advanced his division all the way to the Peach Orchard. The Confederate main line of battle was in sight across the field at the Hamburg-Purdy Road. General Ammon and his brigade were pushing forward through the ravines, and General Chalmers and his Confederates were being pushed back. General Sanders Bruce was bringing Union Kentuckians up the road and through the area where we stand now, and General Hazen advanced his brigade to where the Mans George cabin is right now. General Crittenden's division on out beyond there. General Hardee's Confederates along there. And now at about 10 in the morning, a lot of you are going to remember this, at about 10 in the morning, General John Breckinridge and his reserve corps of the Confederate Army launched Beauregard's most important, largest, and most powerful attack of the 7th of April. 3 full brigades, well organized, well rested, well equipped with lots of ammunition, came attacking straight through those woods, and they came right up on General Nelson's division and General Crittenden's division. We're going to let Bierce tell the story of most of that, but I want to direct your attention to the other side of the field. And when we get to where we are going to read Bierce's narrative, you will be able to imagine the Confederates attacking through those woods against this line of battle, being driven back by this line of battle, having this line of battle lurch after the Confederates, chasing them all the way to the Hamburg-Purdy Road to try to capture the battery of the Washington Artillery, fighting for that battery hand to hand until the Confederates counterattacked, drove them all the way back to this position where the Union reserves attacked the Confederate reserves and drove them all the way back to the Hamburg-Purdy Road.
Which way is the
leaving both armies in a set stalemate. Okay? Kurt, you had a question.
Which way were the lines of battle facing?
Nelson is facing this direction.
Yes.
Crittenden is facing this direction.
Okay.
The Confederates are over at Hamburg-Purdy facing this direction. And then Breckinridge will launch his attack in this direction.
In this direction.
Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Our next stop is the Crescent Monument in the Daniel Davis Wheatfield.
I like that.
Yeah, I know. Well, we're going directly there. So if you
Horatio.
want to come around the long way,
Horatio.
you're going to win.
We've got the first beer on it.
All right, good. Over the fence.
Good. He has to get the beer.
I'm at the point.
Well, I'm glad it's not a higher fence.
Yeah.
He wasn't a member of the Optimist Club. There's a video on YouTube. It's a condensed version of the Planted Outreach. And the video, the video, I've not seen it, but I was just like 30 minutes long or something. The condensed version is only 5 or 6 minutes. It was made by I want to say like a French group. And it just shows the condensed version of it, and it's very impactful. It's very well done.